بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So in today's lecture, inshallah, we are going to continue our discussion of tayammum. In the last lecture, we began with the first few conditions. We'll review those quickly, and then we'll talk about the condition of dirt, which is one of the main conditions that perhaps the Shafi'i madhab is distinguished from some of the other madhab in what can constitute the earth or the dirt that we can use for tayammum. Now, because tayammum, as we said in the previous lecture, is less strong in removing the hadath state than water, and it's rather simply allows us to pray, there are going to be many little details in the discussion of tayammum. What happens when you are using the tayammum but you find water? What happens when you are in your home or in your local area and you lose water and then the water comes back? What happens when you're traveling and then you find water? What happens when you're sick? So on and so forth. So all of these little permutations, inshallah, we are going to discuss them. As well as, of course, we will discuss the obligatory acts of tayammum and the sunnah acts. So just like all of the other acts consistent with our discussion, we will find that the tayammum itself, there are core acts that are arkan, there are obligations without which the tayammum is not valid. Then we will also know that there are sunnahs. So even though the tayammum is not as strong as wudu, there are still sunnahs that are involved with that. Following that, inshallah, the conversation will move to discussing the things that invalidate the tayammum. Just like we talked about what invalidates the khuf, like we talked about what invalidates the wudu, we will also talk about what invalidates the tayammum, because the tayammum, the power of the tayammum, let us say, is limited to a certain amount of time and a certain amount of acts. It's not something that's ongoing. So we will learn about the things that invalidate that. And then we will learn about what happens if you are injured and you have some kind of splint or bandage on your body, al-jabair. And this is a common thing. Of course, the things that we wrap on our bodies now for injuries take different forms, but nonetheless we can't remove them by the order of a doctor. We will learn that there's a distinction between parts of our body, the tayammum parts of our body, which is the face and the arms, and then the other parts of our body. So the fiqh will have a distinction between what happens if you have a bandage on the tayammum parts versus the non-tayammum parts. And then following that, we will talk about how you do the tayammum for the prayers if you are in a long period of time without access to water, inshallah. So let us go over the Arabic and we'll just do the beginning of the tayammum section because it wasn't that much in the last class. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين أمين فصل في التيمم. وشرائط التيمم 5 أشياء: وجود العذر بسفر أو مرض، ودخول وقت الصلاة، وطلب الماء، وتعذر استعماله، وإعوازه بعد الطلب، والتراب الطاهر الذي له غبار فإن خالته جس أو رمل لم يجز. وفرائده 4 أشياء: النية ومسح الوجه ومسح اليدين مع المرفقين والترتيب. وسننه 3 أشياء: التسمية وتقديم اليمنى على اليسرى والموالاة. والذي يبطل التيمم 3 أشياء: ما أبطل الوضوء ورؤية الماء في غير وقت الصلاة والردة. وصاحب الجبائر يمسح عليها ويتيمم ويصلي ولا إعادة عليه إن كان وضعها على طهر ويتيمم لكل فريضة ويصلي بتيمم واحد ما شاء الله من النوافل. Okay. So this is the section, inshallah, that we will occupy ourselves with this class. So he says, rahimahullah, dry ablutions, the tayammum. There are 5 conditions for making dry ablution: the existence of an excuse because of traveling or sickness, the time of prayer having entered, seeking water, an excuse or the incapacity to use water after seeking it, and the existence of pure earth containing dirt, and if it is mixed with gypsum or sand, it does not suffice. Obligatory actions, it has 4 obligatory actions: intention, wiping the face, wiping the hands up to and including the elbows, and in this order. Recommended actions. There are 3 recommended actions: saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wiping the right limb before the left, and performing the actions consecutively. Invalidators. 3 things invalidate the dry ablution: anything that invalidates ablution, seeing or finding water before praying, and apostasy, may Allah protect us. Splints. Someone with a splint wipes over the splint or cast or bondage, performs dry ablution, and then prays. He is not required to repeat the prayer if the splint was applied while he was in a state of ritual purity, and is not on the limbs upon which the dry ablution is made, the face and the arms up to the elbow. Dry ablution and prayers. One makes a dry ablution for each obligatory prayer. One may pray as many supererogatory prayers as one wishes, with a single dry ablution. Okay, now let us go back. Even though we took some of the 2, maybe just for the cohesiveness, we will just quickly review. The 5 conditions for tayammum. Number 1 is that there's an existence such as traveling or sickness, and we talked about how usually traveling means ghaliban. Usually when you travel, you have access to no water or little water, or you have sickness. Number 2 is the time for prayer has entered. And we talked about that the tayammum does not lift the state of the hadith, but simply allows us to pray. So therefore we can only do tayammum when the prayer time has come in, the fard prayer, that is. Seeking water, or making an effort to seek water. Then number 4, the incapacity to use the water after seeking it. It's too far away, it's too expensive, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's not enough, we need it for the children, whatever. There's a incapacity. And then this is where we left off. The existence of pure earth containing dirt. Now, if this earth is mixed with other substances like gypsum or sand, does not suffice. So, what this means is that in the Shafi'i madhab, we only make tayammum sa'idan tayyiban. Imam Shafi'i understood that verse, فَلْيَتَيَمَّمُ sa'idan tayyiban, to be very restrictive and prima facie, meaning the earth that we see outside. You go outside into a plain field, you find the earth, that is what we make the tayammum on. Not the derivatives of the earth like stones and wood, as might be found in some of the other madhab. But in our madhab, it's strictly the earth that has dust on it, meaning that when you tap your hands on the earth, some of the dust, physical dust, will come back to your hands. Now, the idea of gypsum and sand, if the earth outside has other things mixed in it, but those things do not prevent the dirt from transferring to your hands, then it's okay to make wudu. The key is having that dirt that transfers to your hands. So we can't make tayammum from a stone in the Shafi'i madhab. We can't make it from wood. We can't make it from sand. We can't make it on concrete. So rather we need earth that has dirt with it. And that's indicative, as I've tried to show you a little bit, but not spend too much time. This is indicative in the way that Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu understood words. That words, he takes the immediate meaning from the words unless there's a need to have a more nuanced or more broad or liberal meaning. Okay, so these are the conditions. Now what are the obligations? What are the things that you have to do for the tayammum to happen? Number 1 is you have to have the intention. When is the intention? The intention is before that dirt that's on your hands touches the first part of your face. And the intention, as we said, is in the heart. Mahallu niyya al-qalb. So the intention is not something that necessarily needs to be voiced, even though it is custom to voice it, because it trains the heart for the niyyah, and especially if you're a family person, you have family members around you, it's a way to teach them. And that's how we learned growing up, the niyyah for prayer and fasting and all of that from our parents. Nawaitu siyam, nawaitu salah, etc. Number 2 is wiping the face. So wiping the face with that dirt. Number 3 is wiping the hands up to and including the elbows. So from the fingers, in between the fingers, wrist, all the way past the elbow. And in that order. So the way that the tayammum is done, I think now we should talk about that now, is that you tap the earth once, and then you wipe your face. Then you tap the earth a second time, and then you wipe your arm. That's the tayammum. Now, in that order, of course, the face before the hands. One must also convey the earth from a place. Okay, so we have the intention that we are about to make tayammum. We tap the earth. We have some of the dirt that sticks to the hands, and then the intention is right before we do the face, and then the right, and then the left. So that is the way that the tayammum is done. There are some recommended acts for the tayammum. The first is to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before you start, as we found with wudu, and as we found with ghusl and all the rest. Wiping the right hand before the left, or the right arm before the left, as is wudu, and performing the actions consecutively. As we said, the consecutive nature of the acts of worship and acts of devotion is something that is implied in all of our acts, all of our ibadat, all of our recitals, all of our wudu. So that you do the tapping on the face and you don't break off and answer a phone call or help this person out and then come back and do your arms, but you do them, the transaction is one and the same. Now, going over what we talked about in this clip, the conditions, you can see already how with the conditions that we are using a lot of excuses. So we have an excuse not to use water, or we have found water but we have an excuse not to use it. So that's why the purification power of the tayammum is not as strong as wudu. And because it's an excuse, we are doing tayammum in order to engage in something based on an excuse or several excuses. In the next 2 clips, inshallah, we will come to learn some of the different derivatives or the different situations in which you can do tayammum and then there's no makeup, but then you have to do tayammum, or you do tayammum and then you do have to make up the prayer because of those type of conditions that exist, inshallah, and we'll get to that in the next clip. Okay, the next section is the things that invalidate the state of tayammum. The first thing is anything that invalidates wudu. So let's say I make tayammum, the time has come in for dhuhr prayer, I have a valid excuse, there's no water, I make tayammum, and while I get up to make from tayammum to go to the musalla and pray, I pass wind. So I lost my state of tayammum. So for me to pray, I have to go back and do another tayammum. Or you fall asleep, or you go to the bathroom. Or in the Shafi'i madhab, the non-mahram men and women touch. So my wife is passing me something, we're on a trip, and my hand touches her hand. I mean, again, in the strict Shafi'i madhab, that means you would lose your state of tayammum, just like I would have lost my state of wudu. So anything that causes us to lose our wudu, all of the nawaqid of the wudu that we talked about in the previous lectures, are the same nawaqid for the state of the tayammum. Number 2, seeing or finding water before praying. So this is what I want to spend a little bit of time on. Let's say we're at the masjid and there's no water. And it's, many people at the mosque today, it's Maghrib prayer. And the bathrooms are not working. We went to the kitchen. We have access to the neighbors. We call the neighbors, or we message the neighbors, and they're like, "Yeah, we have no water. The water's off in our section. So this is a place in which there usually is water. But at this moment there is no water, and because we're in a mosque situation, we don't have time. We're not going to break the jama'ah and everyone goes to their home or goes to a restaurant or a grocery store and buy water. That's not going to work because of the time that we have to pray. So in this case, we are all going to make wudu. We go outside, we found our patch of dirt, we all make wudu. And by the way, you can use the same area of wudu. It doesn't have to be a fresh piece that no one else has touched before, by the way. We make the tayammum, and then we go back to the mosque, and as we are praying, we hear that the water has come back in the sink. At that moment that the water has come back, our state of tayammum is invalid. So we have to immediately stop. The prayer is not valid. We all have to go make wudu with water, those of us who needed to, and come back and pray. So seeing water or finding water before praying. In the example that I gave, I'm giving the example in which we are in a place in which there usually is water. Now, what happens if we're traveling? Because as he said in the fiqh, the traveling state of traveling is the default state in which there usually isn't any water. So when he says safar, he's saying usually in the state of traveling, you don't have ready access to water. And it doesn't really change in the modern world. If you think about it, the water on the plane or the train, airport, train station, whatever, it's not necessarily always guaranteed that there's going to be water. I mean, it's a little bit better than the pre-modern world, but not that much better. So the same general state still applies. So if I'm in a traveling situation and I don't have access to water, or I have enough water for like the kids and we need it for drinking and that's all we have, it's a long journey, we have fulfilled the check, we checked the box that we have a valid reason not to use the water, we're going to make wudu. And then we start praying, and then somebody calls out, oh, I think the water came back in the bathroom or something like that. That would not necessarily lose our state of tayammum because we are in a situation or in an area in which there usually isn't any water. So those two examples, they will be different. In the mosque example, or if you're at home, the minute you hear the water come back, or you know of the water coming back, that invalidates your tayammum. But in the state of traveling in which there usually isn't any water to start out with, somebody magically appears with water, and you've already started praying, it does not invalidate your tayammum. So seeking or finding water before praying. That's why it's worded that way, before praying. Let me just look in the commentary really quick for something. ورؤية الماء Okay, yeah. So in the traveling example, let me define that a little more. Let me give another sub-example. We're traveling and we don't have any water, and the restroom, the water is out in the restroom. And we're like in a small airport and there's no water in the bathroom. We're traveling, so we're in a state in which usually water does not appear. I'm allowed to make tayammum. I start praying. While I'm praying, or after I pray, somebody comes and says the water's back in the bathroom. In that example, I don't have to make up my prayer. But if we are in the terminal and there was no water in the bathroom, we don't have enough water with us, we make tayammum, we're about to go make tayammum, we haven't prayed yet, or we've made tayammum, but we haven't stood to pray, and then the water comes back. Before the prayer, then we have to go use the water to make wudu and come back. So there's a difference in that. However, if you are muqim, if you're at home or the mosque or the office, I gave the mosque as a simple example, and the water comes back even while you're praying, that's going to invalidate your prayer because you've invalidated your tayammum. You have to go make water. Why? Because this is a place in which there usually is water. So this is a distinction that you're going to have to always make. And then he says apostasy, may Allah Ta'ala protect us, apostasy is people that leave Islam. And as a matter of fact, he will give this example several times throughout that apostasy will breach, obviously it breaches the furu'ah, which would require someone to come back into Islam, to make tawbah and to come back with their shahada and then make up the things that they missed before. Okay, one small example, which is kind of a little bit out there, but it's worth mentioning, is that what do you do to washing a dead person for the ghusl when there is no water? We have to do tayammum. Now let's say we're at the mosque, we're washing the body, there's no water, so we do tayammum on the dead body, and we're about to pray Salatul Janazah, but then we hear the water come. So before we pray the Salatul Janazah, the water has come back, we have to stop what we're doing and actually wash the body with water, because in this case the dead person is like the alive person in the sense that we have to, that tayammum that we did for the deceased is no longer valid. We have to take the body, do the whole washing with actual water, and then we pray on the person. So these are maybe not the best example, but the scenario of washing the body or having to wash a dead body and not finding any water and having to consider tayammum is not something that is so far out there. It's something that might happen. Now, related to this is, let's say I'm at home and there's no water. The water's out for a day, a whole 24-hour period, and I had to make tayammum for each of the 5 prayers. It's very cold outside, I can't go outside to the store and get water. And I made tayammum, I fulfilled the requirements of making tayammum, but when the water comes back, I'm going to have to re-pray those prayers. I'm going to have to make them up because there was that deficiency in a prayer in a place in which there usually is water. So that's another derivative of this conversation, is that some of the prayers that you pray while you are in a state of tayammum you have to make up, like in this scenario, but the prayers in the other states in which you don't have, in which there's not usually water, like the traveling state, are cases in which you don't have to make up the prayer. So it's the same thing, it's sort of an immediate derivative of the question of, if I find water now, does it break my tayammum or not? If it breaks your tayammum, then that means you're in a place in which had you prayed with tayammum, you would have had to make up that prayer. If it's, no, I don't have to, the existence of water doesn't invalidate my tayammum, that I am in a place in which water usually does not exist, therefore if I pray in a state of tayammum, I don't have to later make up those prayers. So that's very, very important, especially for people that are traveling. And there are times when water just cuts off all throughout the world. So this is something that unfortunately happens and we have to be prepared for. So a next derivative of that will be what happens if we have a splint or we have a bandage. We'll talk about that in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, splints. Al-jaba'ir in Arabic. Someone with a splint wipes over the splint or cast or bandage. So anything that's covered. So I don't want you to think it has to be like a big, cast. It could be something very small. But here, the doctor has told you have to cover this wound, or else it will get infected. Once you hear that, khalas, you can't remove it. You now follow this part of the fiqh. So if you have a splint, you are going to wipe over the splint and perform dry ablution and then pray. So in the splint example, we are going to talk about what if the splint is in the body parts in which we make tayammum, i.e. the face and the arms, and the other body parts. So let me just read it and then we'll give the examples. He is not required, or she is not required, to repeat the prayer if the splint was applied while in a state of ritual purity and is not in the limbs upon which the dry ablution is made, the face, arms, up to the elbow. Let's say I sprain my ankle, I have wudu, I go to the doctor, and the doctor wraps my ankle with a bandage, and he says, you have to stay in this for at least 48 hours. The bandage was placed on while I had a state of wudu. How do I make wudu after I lose my wudu for the next prayer? I'm going to make a normal wudu, and when I get to the splint, I'm just going to wipe over it with water if I can, as long as it's not going to be harmful, or even if it's just motion over the water. So I sprained my right ankle, so I'm going to wipe over that. I'm going to wash my left foot, and I'm going to pray. That's it. And there is no repeating of the prayer. Why? Because of the fact that it was placed on while I had a state of wudu. Afwan. Sorry. You have to wipe over it and then make tayammum. My bad. So let's go back. I sprained my right foot. I placed it on while I had wudu. So when I need to make a new wudu, I make a full wudu normally. I wipe over the bandage, if I can with water or a little bit of water. And then I make tayammum the normal way, and then I pray. Because the bandage was placed on me while I had wudu, I do not have to make up that prayer. In that same exact example, if I had placed the bandage on when I did not have wudu, I would do everything the same, but I would have to make up the prayer that I prayed that way. Now, what happens if I broke my wrist? And the wrist is part of the body part that we need for tayammum. So, if I have a bandage on the body parts of tayammum, my face or my arms, no matter what I do, I'm going to have to make up those prayers, but there is a certain procedure that I need to follow in order to be compliant with the Sharia. So, you are going to make the wudu as much as possible, wipe over the bandage, then make the tayammum, and then pray, but that prayer will have to be made up. So, the bandage conversation is a little bit tricky. Most people who have serious injuries and go to the hospital, usually the people that I've interviewed or been in that situation, usually I would say 8 times out of 10 they don't put the bandage on, or the cast or the splint or whatever, they don't put it on while they are in a state of wudu. So that's just something that you have to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that your prayer is wrong, by the way, that you have to make it up. It just means that there was a naqs, there was a deficiency in the prayer, because you did not fulfill all the requirements allowed, and because you couldn't even make a full tayammum because the body part was covered. Out of respect for the prayer time, you're going to go through all of the motions, but you're going to make them up again when you can. It's sort of like the same thing when you lose water at home and then you have to make tayammum and you pray, but then the water comes back, you're going to make up those prayers. It's the same type of situation. Okay, so let's just read that again. Someone with a splint wipes over the splint wherever it is in the body, and then performs the dry ablution and then prays. So they're going to make a full wudu, and when it comes to the bandage, they're just going to wipe over it, but not in a way that would cause any more damage. Then they would make a tayammum, and then they would pray. The next discussion point is, when do you have to make up those prayers? In what scenario? You are not required to repeat the prayer if the splint or bandage or cast was applied, number 1, when you had wudu, and number 2, it is not on the limbs that need to be washed with tayammum, meaning your face and your arms. So if you put the cast or bandage on your foot or something like that, and you had wudu, then you're going to make a full wudu, wipe over the bandage, make tayammum, pray with no makeup. But if you put the bandage on when you don't have wudu, or you put the bandage or the cast or the splint on the body parts of tayammum, then you're going to do the same thing, wash, wipe over the bandage, make tayammum, pray, but then you're going to have to make them up. So that's just something that people that are in that situation, have to keep tabs on, inshallah. And then lastly, he talks about the dry ablution and prayer. He says, rahimahullah, one makes a dry ablution for every obligatory prayer. So, the tayammum, as we said, does not have the power to lift the state of the hadath. simply has the power to allow you to pray. So you can only pray one fard prayer with one tayammum. And you have to wait for that time of that prayer to have come in. But you can pray as many sunnah prayers as you want with a tayammum. So if you're traveling and you need to pray Salat al-Dhuhr, and then you make tayammum with all of the conditions and the niyyah and everything, you could pray the 4 rak'ahs sunnah before Dhuhr, Salat al-Dhuhr, and the 4 rak'ahs after Dhuhr. You want to pray Asr, you're going to have to make another tayammum. And that would go also if you're combining the prayers because of the traveling. So each one requires its own tayammum. But one may pray as many supererogatory prayers as one wishes with a single dry ablution. So the things that require wudu, such as the fard prayer, such as the tawaf, those would require it's a one tayammum per act. But if you wanted to do another one of those obligatory acts, you would need another tayammum. But if they're sunnah prayers, or sunnah prayers would also include, for example, reading the Quran or carrying the mushaf, and you don't have water, and you want to be in a state of wudu or the permissibility of doing that within the Shafi'i madhab, then the tayammum would also allow for that. Tayammum, by the way, can also be made if you are in a state of major ritual impurity and you don't have any water. So we forgot to mention that in the beginning, but if you are in a state of janaba and then you need to do your prayers, and you have no water, then you're also going to make the tayammum. So that's why the tayammum has that weakness in it, because that's not exactly how you get out of janaba. Even wudu doesn't take you out of janaba, you have to do ghusl. So also remember that's another reason why there is that. Maybe weakness is not the right word, but it is not as fulfilling of the lifting of the hadath state as water is of course. So hopefully we got through some of the examples, and I just want to see if there's anything that I missed. One thing you can also add to this discussion, faqid al-tahurain. What if you have no water and no dirt or earth? You have nothing at all. You have no access to nothing. Then in that case, you pray out of respect for the time, and then you make up the prayer. So this is also an important fiqh lesson that shows us the importance of prayer. There is almost no circumstance where you're going to miss prayer. You can miss prayer. There's always a way to pray because of the importance of the institution of prayer. So in today's class, alhamdulillah, we were able to basically go over tayammum from the beginning to the end, even though we covered it a little bit in the last lecture, but I did it from the beginning to the end. So we learned about the conditions for making dry ablution, the conditions for making tayammum. In discussing the conditions for making tayammum, we also started to learn that there are many excuses for the absence of water, or that there is water that we can't use. And embedded in our understanding that there is an excuse for the lack of water is that there is less purity strength in the tayammum than the wudu, which is why later when we discuss different scenarios, sometimes we have to make up those prayers. Moving from there, we talked about the obligatory acts, the intention, the wiping of the face, tapping the ground and transferring the dirt to the face and then to the arms, and doing that in that order. We also spent a little bit of time talking about dirt, earth and dirt, and how that is a specific condition in the Shafi'i madhab, whereas in other madhab it might be a more wider understanding. Then we talked about the recommended acts, of course beginning with the basmalah, as with all acts, wiping the right arm before the left and doing them consecutively. And I reminded you that the consecutive nature of acts of worship is something that we will find through all acts. Whenever you find an act of worship in Islam, the default understanding is that it is consecutive. You can split it up sometimes, but the default, the sunnah, is that it will be consecutive. Then we looked at the things that invalidate. Things that invalidate tayammum or things that invalidate the wudu, in addition to the existence or the entry of water into the scenario. And then we talked a little bit about some of the scenarios about what happens if you lose wudu. What happens if you lose water in a place that usually has water, and what happens if you lose water when you're traveling, i.e., a place that usually doesn't have water. Those two scenarios yield different results with what invalidates the state of tayammum. If you're in a place in which there usually is water, and then water comes, the tayammum is invalid, but not necessarily so in the traveling state. And then we spent some time talking about splints, bandages, and casts, how and when they are placed on the body, if they are placed, how you go about washing for the prayer and wiping over them with the tayammum. And as a derivative of that, we learned that there are certain circumstances which would require us to redo those prayers, just like there are some scenarios that would not require us to redo our prayers after we put on the cast. And then lastly, we talked about how every fard prayer can be done with one tayammum, but we can do as many sunnah prayers as we want with the tayammum. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam.